Hey guys, I hope you're doing well. I guess maybe I should just start with making a quick comment. First of all, my apologies for taking so long to get to these, and thanks for your patience with this assignment that I had. I just had this really big paper on hallucinations that I had to submit, and so I was a little bit delayed with everything else. I mean, I have to say, it wasn't exclusively that was delaying me. It was also that there was a lot of chaos because of everything that's happening. And I mean, I hope that you guys see, to what extent, this course is relevant to what's going on right now, because, I mean, think about this whole, worry about the coronavirus is, the result of humans lacking knowledge. And, you can see directly the harms that, not seeking evidence can cause, the harms that bullshit can cause. A lot of the things that we talked about and about the value of knowledge are kind of concretized in this instance where because humans don't know how to take care of something, they end up, well, dead or sick. In any case, so I guess we'll get a chance to talk about this a little bit more informally once we get to some live sessions or maybe on our WhatsApp chats. But for now, I'm just going to go through the material. So basically what I want to do in this lecture, I think I'm going to separate it from the other lecture, is that I'm going to start by going over the material on Descartes. We've already covered a lot of that, but not all of it. So I'll first recap the stuff that we covered. Then I'll talk about the stuff that we didn't cover. And then from there, I'll move to another reading, which is Achilles and the Tortoise, and talk a little bit about the skepticism about deductive inferences, or maybe about inferences in general. And then I think what I'll do is I'll have a separate video for David Hume's inquiry and the discussion on cause and effect. Okay, so let me just kind of quickly recap. So remember, Descartes he's not a skeptic, he's not somebody who doubts that we have knowledge, but he uses doubt because he thinks that this whole edifice of knowledge that we've built for ourselves, what we think we believe, what we think we know, and the stuff that we believe, all of this stuff he thinks is open to doubt because of our, the fact that we acquired a lot of this knowledge without any critical capacities and without looking for justifications. And so he thinks all of this needs to be destroyed so that we can start again from the beginning, so that we can have a secure foundation for our knowledge. So this was kind of the broad project. And to do this, he says, what I'm going to do is I'm going to, attack or focus on the foundations of all our knowledge, which he takes to be the senses. He thinks that everything that we know either because we perceived it, so we either heard it, saw it, touched it, tasted, smelled it, and so on, or because we acquired it through the senses. So if you hear somebody say something to you, you get a meaning from them, but you get it through your ears. If you read something from someone, you read what they have to say, but you get it through your sense of sight. So the senses seem to be foundational for knowledge. And, he says, well, look, if, our perceptions, our sense perceptions can be doubted, then this means that everything on top of them can be doubted. So everything that we've built on them, and this would ensure skepticism. So to show us, that the senses are doubtful, he uses three hypotheses. We covered two of these, but not the third. So let me quickly recap the first two. The first one is this argument against the senses, and you can see this on page 12 of your reading, where he says, whatever I have up till now accepted as most true, I have acquired either from the senses or through the senses. But from time to time, I have found that the senses deceive, and it is prudent never to trust completely those who have deceived us even once. So, in other words, the argument looks like this. If X deceives you even once, it is not prudent to trust X. The senses have deceived you at least once, so it is not prudent to trust the senses. And the idea is that, insofar as something doesn't always give you correct information, then it doesn't really make sense for you to treat it as if it gives you always correct information. There's always room for doubt insofar as it does that. And we saw that this is true in normal instances, like when we see something in the distance, or when we see something that's very small, or see something in the dark. But also it's true because of all of these illusions that we saw in class. So like I said, we'll go more over these sorts of cases when we look at the stuff on perception. Okay, so that was the first inference, or the first argument against trusting our senses. And now he goes for a second one, which he calls the hypothesis of dreams. And in short, here's what he says. He says, well, look, maybe our senses deceive us about some stuff, but surely they don't deceive us about everything. They don't deceive me right now that I'm looking at my hand, right? And they don't deceive you right now that you're sitting there watching this video that I'm sending to you. Or at least so we might think. But then he says, well, look, maybe my senses don't deceive me about everything, but I'm also a human and a human's dream. And in our dreams, we seem to experience ourselves as being awake, as sensing things with our senses, when in fact this is not the case. So he says, as if I were not, this is now on page 13. By the way, the other one was on page 12 at the very bottom. This is on page 13. He says, as if I were not a man who sleeps at night and regularly has all the same experiences while asleep as madmen do when awake. Indeed, sometimes even more improbable ones. How often, asleep at night, am I convinced of just such familiar events that I am here in my dressing gown, sitting by the fire, when in fact I am lying undressed in bed. So the issue is that we could always be dreaming. So if we're dreaming, then even something as clear as that I'm holding up my hand in front of me would turn out to be false. Because of course, if this is a dream, then my hand is not in front of me. My hand is probably on my side while I'm lying down in bed. I'm not even sitting upright. So he says, then the senses suggest that we could even be deceived about the stuff that is immediately around us. You could, put this argument in this way. You could say, if I know that I'm giving this lecture, then I know that I'm not dreaming, but I don't know that I'm not dreaming, so I don't know that I'm giving this lecture. Now, the first premise just says, if I know I'm giving this lecture, then I know I'm not dreaming. That sounds like it should be right. It sounds like if I am giving a lecture, not just dreaming of giving a lecture, then I should know that I'm not asleep. It seems like, me giving a lecture as opposed to a dream lecture entails that I'm awake. And so if there's some chance that I might be asleep, then I don't know that I'm giving this lecture. I'll actually say more about this in just a little bit. And then the second premise says, I do not know that I'm not dreaming. And this is important, right? Because the idea is that it's not, maybe you know when you're awake that you're awake. But when you're dreaming, you don't know necessarily that you're dreaming. Sometimes when you're dreaming, you take yourself to be awake. So you don't know that you're not dreaming. You might know when you're awake that you're awake. And even that is doubtful, because the problem is that if you know that you're awake when you're awake, then it means that you can be sure that wakefulness is different from dreaming. But you can't, because in dreams, you take yourself to be awake. So, as a result, if I know that I'm giving this lecture, then I know I'm not dreaming. But I don't know that I'm not dreaming, so then I don't know that I'm giving this lecture. This is the argument that Descartes has in mind. And so what this would show us is that possibly right now, at this very moment, I might be asleep. It might look to me like I'm awake, but since wakefulness can't be distinguished from sleeping in from dreaming in this very clear way, then it looks like I could be dreaming right now. Okay, so the question is, what does this establish? Let's say that our senses deceive us, so we can't be sure of a lot of things because of our senses. And now it could be that we're dreaming, so we can't even be sure that I'm holding up my hand or that you guys are watching this video. And now he says this. Again, this is on page 13. He says, suppose then that I am dreaming, and that these particulars, that my eyes are open, that I'm moving my head and stretching out my hands, are not true. Perhaps, indeed, I do not even have such hands or such a body at all. You could be, imagine that you've had an arm amputation and you're asleep and you dream of having an arm, or, even more radically, you might be another sort of creature altogether having the dream of being a human. Imagine a cat dreaming of being a human or a human dreaming of being a cat. These seem like possible dreams. And so, the idea is that I might not even be sure that I have the body that I have or that I look like I do. You don't have to be a cat. You could be, I've had a dream where I was somebody else. I was in just a different character. So in that dream, I took myself to have a certain sort of body and to be a certain person, when in fact I was not that person and I did not have that sort of body. So, nevertheless, it must surely be admitted that the visions which come in sleep are like paintings, which must have been fashioned in the likeness of things that are real, and hence that at least these general kinds of things, eyes, head, hands, and the body as a whole, are things which are not imaginary but are real and exist. For even when painters try to create sirens and satyrs with the most extraordinary bodies, they cannot give them natures which are new in all respects. They simply jumble up the limbs of different animals. Or if perhaps they manage to think up something so new that nothing remotely similar has ever been seen before, something which is therefore completely fictitious and unreal, at least the colors used in the composition must be real. So just think about what he's saying over here. He says, okay, well, look, what does, let's say I am dreaming. Does this show me that I don't know anything? Here's what it does show me. He says, look, just think of the image as, think of the dream as being like a picture or an image. When an artist paints a picture, let's say he paints a dragon or she paints a dragon. When they paint the dragon, the dragon has all sorts of features that no real animal has, but nevertheless, these features are copied from real animals. So, dragons have tails, and we got the idea of a tail from something else. Maybe they have scales, and we got this idea from, for instance, lizards. Maybe they breathe fire, and, we have the idea of fire. So we take all of these little chunks and we combine them together into this fictitious whole, the dragon. He says, even an artist who's very creative, who comes up with something that has never been seen before, must nevertheless paint it with real colors and use real lines in order to draw it. So because of this, even if what I'm dreaming right now is all fake, in the sense that I'm not really in my living room, I'm not really giving this lecture and so on, that maybe I don't have this particular face that I have. Nevertheless, you could still be sure that the components that make up the dream are real components. So for instance, that things have borders, that, there's such a thing as human faces, that even if not this face, but at least, these more general things. In fact, the idea that Descartes has is that it's like in the dream, the combination is fake. But the bits that make up this combination, they're not fake. They're real things, because the dream is being now compared to a picture. And although a picture that is a completely fictitious picture is as a whole fake, its different components are real. The lines are real, the colors are real, and so on. So maybe you're unsure that you're seeing me right now, but you could be sure of things like there is the color green, or there are things that people wear on their eyes, or there are human eyes, and so on. So, in fact, Descartes wants to go even more generally than this. He says, forget like specificities like eyes or colors or whatever. He says, what seems to be undoubtful even if we're going through a dream right now is, well, here I'm quoting on page 14, he says, this class appears to include corporeal nature in general, so the class of things that are not doubtful via dreams, and its extension. So This class appears to include corporeal nature in general and its extension, the shape of extended things, the quantity or size and number of these things, the place in which they may exist, the time through which they may endure, and so on. So he says, basically what we won't doubt through dreams is like some very basic things, that there's quantities of things, that there's like more, that there's, a cup and me and, the iPad I'm reading from, the pen I'm looking at, and so on. Maybe that things have sizes, that things can take up space. All of this stuff remains not doubtful, even if I am dreaming right now. He says, so a reasonable conclusion from this might be that physics, astronomy, medicine, and all other disciplines which depend on the study of composite things are doubtful. So any discipline, like biology or physics, which depends on the study of things that are not basic, composite things, things that are combined from other things, are going to be doubtful, while arithmetic, geometry, and other subjects of the kind, which deal only with the simplest and most general things, regardless of whether they really exist in nature or not, contain something certain and indubitable. So the idea is that sciences like arithmetic or geometry, things like which will focus on just lines or numbers, these are not going to be doubtful even if we're dreaming. Anyway, this is the basic idea. So it looks like even though the skepticism about what the senses give us and about the possibility that we might be dreaming, so the fact that we could doubt that we're awake right now and the fact that we could doubt our senses doesn't show us that we don't know anything. We still know something, namely the most basic things. Things like there is the number 1, there is the number 2, there are colors, there are lines. Maybe these things remain certain, even though everything else is uncertain. I might be unsure that I have this body, that I'm speaking to you, that, the objects in front of me have the colors that they have. All of this I could be doubting, but I can't be doubting that, there is the number 1 or something like that. Okay, so this now destroys a lot of our, trust in what we think we know, but it doesn't destroy everything. So now Descartes wants to go, in fact, the whole way. And this is where he introduces a third hypothesis, which is related to God. So let me just go through this a little bit slowly. So this is one of the new items, one of the things that we didn't cover before. So on page 14, towards the second half of the page, I'm sorry, I know this keeps changing colors, but I don't know how to stop that because the background is light behind me, and I like this background, but at the same time, it keeps doing that annoying effect. So he says, and yet firmly rooted in my mind is the long-standing opinion that there is an omnipotent God who made me the kind of creature that I am. How do I know that he has not brought it about that there is no earth, no sky, no extended thing, no shape, no size, no place, while at the same time ensuring that all these things appear to me to exist just as they do now? What is more, just as I consider that others sometimes go astray in cases where they think they have the most perfect knowledge, how do I know that God has not brought it about that I too go wrong every time I add 2 and 3, or count the sides of a square, or in some even simpler matter, if that is imaginable? So here's now the possibility that he considers. He says, look, in my mind, I have this idea that there's a God that exists, okay? And now, here's what he wants to think about. He wants us to think about, if God existed, could God deceive you about these most basic things that you think you know? Your senses could deceive you about things that are far away or in the dark. Dreams could deceive you about the configuration, the collection of items that you're perceiving right now. But we said these most basic units, like that there is the number 1 or that the sides of a triangle are 3, right, are supposed to be more basic and not doubtful from dreams or from our senses. But the question is, if God decided to deceive you about these things, could he do that? So there's a question about this, right? If God decided that we should, every time we counted the number 1, we get it wrong. For instance, it turns out that it's not 1. Could God do that? Well, here's the thing. Insofar as we think of God as an omnipotent being, we think that she would be able to do that. After all, God could do anything. God is infinitely more powerful than we are. So if God is more powerful than we are, and absolutely more powerful than we are, then it seems that God could deceive us about any of the things that it wishes to deceive us about, even about those most basic things. It could be that you think to yourself 1 + 1 = 2, and you get it wrong systematically because God decrees that you are going to get this wrong. That every time you add 1 + 1, you're going to think that the answer is 2, when in fact the answer is 3. It could be that God makes you think that there are lines and colors, but there are no lines and colors. And this seems to be possible because if God is all-powerful, then God can do anything whatsoever. This is Descartes' point. And now he's not saying God is deceiving us. He's just saying, we have this idea of God. Now let's think, could God, if it wanted to, deceive us about these most basic things? And it seems like the answer is yes, because God is all-powerful. Now look at the next step of his argument. He says, but perhaps God would not have allowed me to be deceived in this way, since he is said to be supremely good. But if it were inconsistent with his goodness to have created me such that I am deceived all the time, it would seem equally foreign to God's goodness to allow me to be deceived even occasionally. Yet this last assertion cannot be made. So here's what he's saying. Descartes is pointing out, look, God could do this, but would God really deceive us? Descartes points out that no, it seems like since God is supremely good, it wouldn't deceive us about these things. In fact, it wouldn't let us be deceived at all, because after all, deception, he doesn't say this here, but elsewhere he says this, is a sort of weakness or defectiveness. And since God is all good and, all kind and so on, God wouldn't allow us to be deceived. But then he hesitates and he says, well, look, if it's not consistent with God's ability and God's goodness that God deceive us about these basic things all the time, then it should be the case that God would never deceive us even some of the time. But think about it. Are we deceived some of the time? Well, it seems like we've already said that yes, we are deceived some of the time. Sometimes our senses deceive us. We seem to see one thing looking like it's green when in fact it's not green. Or we see something as being small when in fact it's large. So we are deceived sometimes. Clearly, if God exists right now, God's existence and God's goodness doesn't guarantee that God would never allow us to be deceived. Since we're sometimes deceived, then clearly God's existence and our being sometimes deceived are consistent, which means it's not a contradiction to think that we're being deceived while God exists. But if that's the case, and God could deceive us about some of the things, then it seems perfectly possible that God could also deceive us about all of the things. Which means that even the most basic pieces of knowledge are now doubtful, because after all, God could be deceiving us about them. We know that this wouldn't be inconsistent with God's goodness. Even if we grant that God is good, we can't say that God would never do this, because in fact, if God exists, then it already does this. It deceives us about some things. We're deceived in our dreams, we're deceived via our senses, we sometimes add a sum incorrectly. So all of these things show that God's existence is not inconsistent with our being mistaken. Okay, let me just write out this argument in premise-conclusion form. And I should say, all of these premise-conclusion versions that I've been kind of speaking out here, I'll put a handout on Blackboard where you can pick up all of these arguments. So here's the argument that Descartes uses, and you can think of this as a reductio argument. It's an argument that starts from an assumption, which we're going to... I shouldn't have said that. It's not a reductio argument. It's a normal deductive argument. Okay, so ignore that. Here's the argument. Premise 1 starts by saying God exists. Okay? Now, premise 2 says that if God exists, then it can deceive me about the most basic facts. So, God exists, and if God exists, then it can deceive me about the most basic facts. Premise 2, if God exists, then it can deceive me about the most basic facts, seems like something that's entailed by God being all-powerful. If God is infinitely powerful, then it should be able to deceive us about the most basic facts. So from this, I can conclude that God can deceive me about the most basic facts. Okay, well, now I can add a third premise, and it says, if God exists and I am sometimes deceived, then God's existence is compatible with my wholesale deception. So, if God exists and I'm sometimes deceived, then God's existence is compatible with my full deception. And we know this because we know that if at the same time God is really there and we still make mistakes, then it seems that if God could make us make mistakes some of the time, then God could make us make mistakes all of the time. And now here's the thing. I am sometimes deceived. So, I'm assuming that God exists. I'm assuming that I am sometimes deceived. From these two assumptions, that God exists and I'm sometimes deceived, I can infer that it's compatible with God's existence and God's goodness, more specifically, that I'm always deceived. So, it's possible the conclusion is that God's existence is compatible with my wholesale deception. So, again, Descartes is not saying that God is deceiving you about everything. Descartes is just showing us that God's existence is not incompatible with us being deceived about everything. Because somebody could worry about this. Somebody could be like, look, Descartes, you're going too far. You're saying that we're deceived about everything. But actually, God protects us from deception. God protects us from making mistakes in our thinking, in our basic thinking. Descartes is answering to this person. Descartes, with the person who believes in God, says, well, look, I believe in God too. But if I believe that God exists right now, and simultaneously I'm sometimes deceived, then this pretty much shows that God's existence and my deception are not incompatible. So it's possible that God is deceiving us about everything. God's goodness does not contradict us being wholesale mistaken. Okay, so that's the third argument. And as you can see, this argument goes further than the other two. Because while the deception of the senses only showed us that some things are doubtful, and the deception of dreams showed us that some other things are doubtful, the possibility that God is deceiving us shows us that everything is doubtful. And Descartes doesn't need to show us that God is really giving us mistakes. Descartes just has to show us that God's existence is compatible with us being in general mistaken. And now he's just shown this. So, to kind of dramatize this issue, Descartes says this. Look at him on page 15, hesitating a little bit. He says, but it's not enough merely to have noticed this. I must make an effort to remember it. My habitual opinions keep coming back, and despite my wishes, they capture my belief, which is, as it were, bound over to them as a result of long occupation and the law of custom. A little bit later, he says, in view of this, I think it will be a good plan to turn my will in completely the opposite direction and deceive myself by pretending for a time that these former opinions are utterly false and imaginary. So what's he saying here? He's saying, look, the problem is that we're so used to believing the things that we believe that in a way it's like a habit. And now he wants to avoid this habit. And so he says, it's not enough for me to have thought this. I need to kind of stick with this thought. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pretend to myself that I am really deceived about all of these things. And so now he envisions this scenario that will help him do this. He says, I will suppose, therefore, that not God, who is supremely good and the source of truth, but rather some malicious demon of the utmost power and cunning, has employed all its energies in order to deceive me. I shall think that the sky, the air, the earth, colors, shapes, sounds, and all external things are merely the delusions of dreams, which God has devised to ensnare my judgment. I shall consider myself as not having hands or eyes or flesh or blood or senses, but as falsely believing that I have all these things. I shall stubbornly and firmly persist in this meditation, and even if it is not in my power to know any truth, I shall at least do what is in my power, that is, resolutely guard against assenting to any falsehoods, so that the deceiver, however powerful and cunning it may be, will be unable to impose on me in the slightest degree. So this is how he ends the first meditation. He says, since God's existence is compatible with our deception, let's not think of there being a God. Let's think of there being this evil demon that is as powerful as God, but just evil. And now we're going to say to ourselves, this evil demon is deceiving me about everything, so that everything is now doubtful. And remember, this is just a dramatization. Descartes is not saying there really is an evil demon, or we should replace God with an evil demon, or believe in an evil demon. He's just saying, look, God's existence is compatible with me being wholesale deceived. So for all it matters, we could just imagine that there's this evil demon that's deceiving me about everything. And this is going to ensure that we're now really going to be skeptical about all the things that we think that we know. And so at this point, it looks like Descartes has established that the foundations, the most basic things that our knowledge gives us, come from the senses, but our senses could be mistaken. Even those most basic ideas that come from our senses could be mistaken. And so as a result, it looks like we don't know anything. Okay. So this is Descartes' skepticism, right? The skeptical argument that he gives. And like I said, he's not committed to this, so he's actually going to set this up in order to challenge it. But for now, he's shown us this. Now, I just want to say something. So look, from here, what we're going to do is we're going to look at Descartes' solution. But then I'm going to try to explain to you what's so significant or interesting about Descartes' solution using the later reading Achilles and the Tortoises. So I guess let's get to that next. Okay. So now, in Meditation 2, Descartes is going to give us what he takes to be the solution to this generalized skepticism that he's produced, So if you look at page 16, he says, I will suppose then that everything I see is spurious. So it's, open to doubt, right? Or it's false in some sense. I will believe that what my memory tells me are lies, and that none of the things that it reports ever happened. I have no senses. Body, shape, extension, movement, and place are all chimeras. So what remains true? Perhaps just the one fact that nothing is certain. So now he's saying, look, given the three hypotheses, the evil demon hypothesis, the dreams hypothesis, and the senses hypothesis, everything that I think is false. And so maybe the only thing that's true is that I'm not certain of anything. Now he asks this on the bottom of page 16, about midway through that final paragraph. He says, am I not at least something? So he asks, what about me, am I not something? And now he says, but I have just said that I have no senses and no body. This is the sticking point. What follows from this? So you said you have no senses and you have no body. Well, does this mean that you're gone? That there's no you? In other words, can you doubt that you exist? And doubt it because you doubt that you have senses and you have a body, that you have emotions, that my name is Rami, and so on. He says this is the sticking point. What follows from this? Am I not so bound up with the body and with the am I not so bound up with a body and with senses that I cannot exist without them? But I have convinced myself that there's absolutely nothing in the world, no sky, no earth, no minds, no bodies. Does it not follow, too, that I don't exist? No. If I convinced myself of something, then I certainly existed. But there's a deceiver of supreme power and cunning who is deliberately and constantly deceiving me. In that case, I too undoubtedly exist. If he's deceiving me, and let him deceive me as much as he can, he will never bring it about that I am nothing so long as I think that I am something. So, after considering everything very thoroughly, I must finally conclude that this proposition, I am, I exist, is necessarily true whenever it is put forward by me or conceived in my mind. So here's the interesting argument that Descartes lands on. He points out that, let's say you doubt everything. You doubt that you're listening to me right now, that you're you, that you have the family that you have, that you're in Lebanon, that there's the coronavirus happening, that you're a student in LAU. You doubt everything. You doubt that this hand is in front of you right now. You doubt your name. You doubt that you have eyes and that you have this body and so on. Does this mean that you doubt that you exist? Well, the problem is that it can't mean that, because if you're doubting something and being convinced by the doubt, then you've at least demonstrated that there is something that is doubting and that is convinced by the doubt. And let's say there's an evil demon. Let's say there is no God, there's just this evil demon that uses all its powers to deceive you about everything whatsoever. Well, if it deceives you about all of these things, then there is something that is being deceived, you. So it seems that it can't get you to doubt your own existence, because just the fact that you doubt demonstrates, at the very least, the existence of that doubt. So in other words, every thought that you have, even if it's a thought that I don't know anything, demonstrates that at least that thought exists. So from thinking, you can infer the being of that thinking. So from the fact that I think that I doubt everything around me, that proves that there is that doubt, that I doubt everything around me. And so this is what Descartes means by this kind of famous claim. I think, well, here they put it as I am, I exist, but the more popular way that it's been put is I think, therefore I am. Or in maybe a more accurate way would be that thinking demonstrates the being of that thinking. So having a thought demonstrates that that thought exists. Or, as Descartes was putting it, I think, so my thinking demonstrates that I exist. Maybe this is a bit too broad, because you might want to just say, well, I don't know that I in the personal sense exist. And Descartes agrees with this. He thinks that what he means by I is the thing that thinks. So from thinking, you can prove that there is something that thinks. And this is, the I think, therefore I am, or as he puts it here, I am, I exist. And now he says, I have to conclude that it's necessarily true whenever I think it. So in other words, the fact that I think demonstrates the existence of the thought. So as long as I think, I know that something exists. I can't be deceived about everything. And so Descartes has shown us that despite the possibility of an evil demon, and despite the deception of the senses and deception of dreams, there is one thing you cannot be uncertain about. And this is the fact that you exist. You know you exist with certainty because your existence is demonstrated by the fact that you have any thought. It doesn't matter whether this thought is a thought of doubt or a fear or, a hope, or anything that you think demonstrates the existence of that thought. Okay, look, what's interesting about this is that, in a way, when we say, I think, therefore I am, that's not a great way to put it. Because the therefore, so if you say I think, and then therefore I am, you make it look like the therefore is the result of an inference. It's like I think is one premise, and then I'm getting a conclusion, I exist. Now, the issue is that this is not how it is. This isn't an inference, at least not for Descartes, because what's the second premise? Let's say you say I think. Then you have to say everything that thinks exists. Therefore, I exist. But Descartes doesn't think that you know premise 2. He doesn't think that you know that anything that thinks exists. He says this only works for me. My thought demonstrates its existence. He's not saying anything that thinks if you think you exist. He hasn't proven other people or proven that thoughts in general produce existence. All he's shown us is that the thought entails the being of the thought. So this is not an argument. It's not a deductive argument. He's not saying, I think if something thinks it exists, therefore I exist. There's no second premise. He thinks of this as he thinks of it, it's a self-evident claim. It's something that has its own evidence in it. Just from the fact of thinking, I can get to the fact of existence. And this is not an argument. It's not an inference that we're making. Now, why is this significant? Well, it's important because think of it this way. If inference is open to doubt, and it is because God could confuse you about deductive logic. God could make you think that certain rules work in deductive logic when in fact they don't work. So if Descartes' "I think, therefore I am" depended on deductive logic, then it would be open to doubt, because then you have an inference which is itself open to doubt. By contrast, by making it a self-evident premise or a self-evident claim, he removes all room for doubt. You can see this kind of nicely illustrated by the reading Achilles and the Tortoise, which in fact tries to show us exactly that. It tries to show us that inferences, and including deductive inferences, are never things that we can get to with any certainty. And it's done in this really kind of interesting way, because it's written as a story between Achilles, this this kind of ancient hero, and the tortoise, and it's written by Lewis Carroll, who's the guy who wrote Alice in Wonderland. And so I'm going to now turn to that, and I'm going to read some chunks of it to show you what its main point is. What it's going to try to prove to us, just like Descartes tried to show us that the senses can't be trusted, this argument is going to try to show us that deductive reasoning or logic can't be trusted, or at least that there's always a gap in it of a certain sort. So here's the discussion that happens between Achilles and the tortoise. I'm going to just read chunks of it, so look at the bottom of page 256. And here's now, I think that it's the tortoise that's speaking, and it says this. Well, now let's take a little bit of the argument in the first proposition. Just 2 steps and the conclusion drawn from them. Kindly enter them into your notebook. And in order to refer to them conveniently, let's call them A, B, and Z. So here's now an argument that we're going to be given. Its first premise is A, its second premise is B, and its final premise is Z. He says, things that are equal to the same are equal to each other. This is premise 1. So things, 2 things, let's say, that are equal to the same are going to be equal to each other. And now we say the 2 sides of this triangle are things that are equal to the same. So therefore, the 2 sides of the triangle are equal to each other. Roughly, the argument is this. He's saying, you take these 2 objects, and they're both equal to a third object, the one that we're going to put in the middle. They're not equal, I know, but just pretend. So we're saying, if this one is equal to this one, and this one is equal to this one, then it means that this one is equal to this one. And that's true, you know. If I'm the same height as you and you're the same height as her, then I'm the same height as her. And he just does this with 2 triangles. He says, things that are equal to the same are equal to each other. The 2 sides of this triangle are equal to the same. So the 2 sides of this triangle are equal to each other. Now, here's what he wants to say. Readers of well, I'm now going to continue reading. He says, readers of Euclid will grant, I suppose, that the Z follows logically from A and B, so that anyone who accepts A and B as true must accept Z as true. And this is really when I started the course with deductive logic, that's what I said. I said that, you know, in some inferences, if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true, because these arguments are deductively valid. And it sounds like this is a version of a valid argument, where you're saying if 2 things are equal to the same thing, then here's these 2 lines and they're equal to the same thing, then they must be equal to one another. I think I missaid that, but I think you guys get the point. And now he says, I think this is still the tortoise. And so now here's what's going to happen. We're going to try to show that this inference we just made is somehow not as good as we thought it was. He says, and if some reader has not yet accepted A and B as true, he might still accept the sequence as a valid one, I suppose. So even if you don't believe the specific premises, you still believe that inferential structure. This is what we call the validity of the argument or the form of the argument. No doubt, validity is a specific form. I didn't mean to say that validity and form are the same thing. No doubt such a reader might exist. He might say, I accept as true the hypothetical proposition that if A and B are true, Z must be true. But I don't accept A and B as true. So this is normal, you know. You could accept that this argument is valid, but not accept that this argument is sound. This is all that they're saying here. And now the turtle asks another question. And might there also not be some reader who would say, I accept A and B as true, but I don't accept the hypothetical? And neither of these readers, the tortoise continued, is as yet under any logical necessity to accept Z as true. So here's roughly what this tortoise is saying. It's saying you could, in the inference, A is true, B is true, and then Z is true, you could reject the truth of A, you could reject the truth of B, and so you'll reject the inference for that reason. But you could also reject that this is deductively valid or that this is a form of argument for whatever reason. So you could reject the hypothetical, as they're putting it in the reading. Now, here's the tortoise's challenge. What the tortoise is going to try to show is that every argument of this form is going to require a further premise in order to establish the argument. But the problem is that any further premise we're going to add is going to itself require a further premise, and so we end up in a sort of infinite regress. So in other words, we kind of keep infinitely adding more premises. So it says, a little bit later, now on page 257, so here's what you don't accept. You don't accept that if A and B are true, Z must be true. This is what you would reject if you reject the inference as a whole. So now the tortoise says, this is my present position. It says, look, I accept that A is true and I accept that B is true, and what I reject is that if A and B are true, then Z must also be true. And now let's call that premise, if A and B are true, Z must be true, let's call that C. So now Achilles says, then I must ask you to accept C. So now the tortoise says, okay, well fine, let's write the argument out again. So now, again, it's still on page 257. He says, the tortoise says, now write as I dictate. Well, there's premise A. Things that are equal to the same are equal to each other. And then premise B. The two sides of this triangle are things that are equal to the same. And now usually we would just have Z after this, but now we're going to add something else. We're going to say if A and B are true, Z must be true. So now the Z is the two sides of this triangle are equal to each other. So now we have the same argument roughly, but we've now added a premise. Because the original argument says things that are equal to each other are equal to the same. The two sides of this triangle are things that are equal to the same. Therefore, the two sides of this triangle are equal to each other. But now what we have is that things that are equal to the same are equal to each other. The two sides of this triangle are things that are equal to the same. If A and B are true, that's the first two premises, then Z is true. And now Z, the two sides of this triangle are equal to each other. But now the problem is this. So now if we accept A, B, and C, we get to Z. But the tortoise now asks, and why must I accept A, B, and C give me Z? And now Achilles says, because it follows logically from them. If A and B and C are true, Z must be true. You don't dispute that, I imagine. The tortoise answers, if A and B and C are true, Z must be true, the tortoise thoughtfully repeated. That's another hypothetical, isn't it? And if I fail to see its truth, I must accept A, B, and C and still not accept Z, mustn't I? So the tortoise is pointing out that this additional premise that we included, that if A and B are true, Z must be true, is now going to, for me to accept the whole argument, I have to accept that if A and B and C are true, then they give me Z. But that's another premise. If A and B and C are true, they must give me Z. So now the tortoise asks them to add this premise. So now the argument looks like this. There's A, things that are equal to the same are equal to each other. There's B, the two sides of this triangle are things that are equal to the same. There's C, if A and B are true, Z must be true. And then there's D, which says if A and B and C are true, then Z must be true. And now you can get to Z. But the problem is, what if you don't accept that A, B, C, and D give you Z? Well, now you have to include that in your argument, which will give us a premise E, which will now say, if A and B and C and D and E are true, then this must give us Z. But now, what if I don't accept this for A, B, C, D, and E giving us Z? So now I have to add this premise, and so on. So it looks like every deductive argument you're going to give is going to require a further proposition for somebody who doubts that the inference. If somebody doubts that if A is true and if B is true, then Z is true, then to prove it to them, I have to get them to believe that hypothetical, that if A and B are true, Z is true. So I have to include that as an official premise. So now we have 4. And if we have 4, well, I have to show that from these 3, I can get the 4th one. So that becomes the 4th, and now the conclusion is the 5th, and so on. So it looks like all inferences are doomed to become infinitely long, and that's a problem. But here's now what's really interesting. What's interesting is that if Descartes is right, and the I think proves that I exist, or the thinking proves the being of the thinking, then Descartes can avoid this sort of argument altogether. He doesn't need to use deductive reasoning in order to establish his conclusion, which means that even if Carroll is right that deductive inferences can't be made to work in the way we thought they can, and even if Descartes is right that there's an evil demon, or he's not, or as he hypothesizes, there's an evil demon, even if both these things are true, you could still get the conclusion, I think I exist. And this means that you can overcome skepticism, and you can overcome skepticism even if the senses deceive you, and even if your reasoning is always incomplete in a certain way. Okay, so then this shows us, I hope, what's interesting about Carroll's skepticism. He's trying to show us that all of these deductive arguments that we depend on further premises that need to be accepted, and it seems like all deductive arguments become infinitely long. And maybe not completable, because any number of premises you're going to add, you're going to need a further premise that ties them with their conclusion. So deductive inferences might not be completable, and this might be one reason for skepticism. The senses deceive us, and the senses are not to be trusted for various reasons, and that's another reason for skepticism. And now we've seen one reason for not being skeptical, which is Descartes' argument of I think I exist. The next thing we want to do is we want to look at Hume's argument, and I'm not going to do it in the same video, but I'll have it uploaded shortly. And this argument is interesting because, in fact, Hume's argument isn't going to focus on the senses or on inferences. What it's going to focus on is the relation between cause and effect. Look, we think that me letting go of this pen let this pen fall. So we think that this is my, opening my hand was the cause of the pen falling. Or, this is a toy example, but, you could think that gravity is the cause of the pen falling. We, in general, think that there's a link between the causes of things and their effects. And what Hume is going to try to show is that this link is not as strong as we might have thought otherwise. Okay, well, I hope that this was clear, and like I said, I'll have a handout which I think you should use during watching this, and I'll upload the next video shortly.